This is from r/Askreddit. Enjoy. What's the creepiest thing you have experienced but nobody believes you when you tell them? This is long story. When I was younger, like 8 to 10 years old, I was at my dad's house for the weekend and was helping him paint my stepsister's bedroom while herself, my other stepsister and my stepmom were all out of town. Me and Dad were a good hour or so into painting the room hot pink. We'd done a primer coat of paint and were going to take a break to go downstairs and get lunch before applying the actual color. I was sitting beside the ladder in the middle of the room playing my DS while my dad was putting the paint roller away. When he turned around to help me stand up, he noticed something on the wall. This thing looked like a red face. It had sharp features, pointed teeth, angled eyes, defined cheekbones, and a lower jaw that seemed like it was separated from the rest of the face. I remember my dad pointing it out and asking if I drew that. I said no and we both started getting this really heavy, odd feeling. He took my hand and said, "Come on. Let's go to Tim Hortons for lunch instead," because originally we're just going to have macaroni and hot dogs. We went to Tim Hortons and when we came back, the face was gone. That's what we didn't understand. Where did it go? The only other people that would have had access to the house was my step-family. But all three of them were visiting my stepmother's mother at her home in a town almost 2 hours away. The face was situated in the upper middle part of the wall beside the bedroom door, so it's not like one of the cats could have scrubbed against the wall and brushed it off. Also, how was the face red? Before the room was being painted pink, it was blue. Before it was blue, it was white. White was the original color of the wall the painters had applied to it when the house was new. My dad was the first person to ever live in that house. So it's not like someone else could have painted the wall red and then made it white again. Did anything else weird happen the rest of the time you were painting? Here's that comment. My dad had shit going on in his house. So much shit that almost every kid who would come in, myself, my sisters, my brother and my dad, have all had multiple experiences in there. I remember one time, I was going upstairs to have a shower. The bathroom was the end of the hallway and on the way to it, I had to pass by the room I shared with my sisters when I was over for the weekends. As I passed by, I seen something sit up on the bottom bunk. We had bunk beds in there, out of the corner of my eye. This thing looked like a little girl. She had pale skin, short black hair that was cut in a bob style with straight bangs covering her forehead, and her eyes were these massive circles with large black dots in the center for pupils. She was facing sideways so her right shoulder was facing me when she turned her head. The other half of her body looked like it was under the blankets. I remember getting such an intense feeling of fear that I went back downstairs and refused to go upstairs at all or even sleep in the house. My dad had to set up the camping tent in the backyard for the rest of the weekend. Once I got dropped off at like 1 in the morning in the Shedis bus stop in Tampa, even worse than a Greyhound station. Everyone in the stop got picked up one by one. My phone was dead so I had to charge it to call at Uber. Suddenly I'm all alone in the only lit part of this open huge area in a bad part of town. I see a dude in the distance come towards me. Mind you, I called for an Uber like at most 2 minutes prior to seeing him come towards me. He takes like 2 to 3 more to get to me. Just as he sits next to me, my Uber pulls up and gets down from the car real fast to get my bags. The dude that sat down muttered, "You're real lucky, boy." I got chills that lasted an entire day. My Uber driver looked at me angrily and didn't speak almost at all the entire ride and gave me a bad rating. I think I might have been robbed or even killed at night, and my Uber driver thinks he probably could have too. I'll never forget that moment, never. Edit. Nobody believes me because it really sounds too perfect of timing to be true to some, so I never really tell anyone anymore. Labor Day weekend '83, while a teenager, I was camping with some friends in the woods nearby, a neighborhood. It was back when we had 4 distinct seasons in the Midwest, and this was the last fun camping weekend of the year. That night, I slipped off without them seeing me and laid about 100 feet away in the brush. It took them a while, 15 minutes or so, to realize I was gone. They searched and called for me, finally giving up and returning to the camp. Yeah, we were partying. Anyway, while I was laying there, all of a sudden I felt a motion to my right and a large boot landed a few inches from my face. I stayed completely still, and he was there, watching them for a few minutes. I looked up his leg and briefly saw his face, but soon the stranger turned and left. I waited a couple minutes, then bolted back to the fire. None of them knew he was there. Nobody slept a wink that night, and it was the last time we camped there. A few weeks later, a nearby boy disappeared, then another one. Finally, they caught the guy. When I saw his picture, I had a panic attack of sorts. I swear this was him. John Albert. He was an Air Force airman stationed at the base in our city. A kid in my neighborhood had him as a scoutmaster, and our neighbor was the boss of the second kid's father. We didn't know that he killed in Maine before going into the Air Force, and it has been said that is why he went into the military after the murder, to get out of the area. Edit to add a response to a question below. Years later, I knew some guys that knew him in the Air Force. Posters were all over the maintenance hangar with a composite sketch, and they teased him about looking similar to the guy in the poster. He would just chuckle and shrug it off. Yes, they were all shocked when he was arrested. They said there was no indication whatsoever about that side of him. Years ago at me and my now partner's house in Chicago, I experienced something that I've never been able to explain. My partner was on a backpacking trip to South America, and it had been gone over a month and was still a couple months away from returning. We usually rented out the extra bedrooms in the house, but less than a month before he was leaving for the trip, the two roommates upstairs had moved out, and we had decided to leave them empty while he was out of town instead of trying to find more roommates on short notice, and also use the time to update the paint and pull the carpeting and refinish the wood floors underneath. Anyways, I had come home from work about 8 p.m. and decided I was going to take a shower and then get dressed up a little and go out to the bars to meet up some friends, as it was a Friday evening and I didn't have to work the next day. I take my shower, head into my bedroom, and start pulling on my clothes. My bedroom is on the garden level, which is like a walkout half-basement common in Chicago bungalows, and my bed is up against the wall under the concrete steps that led to the front door, which has a heavy wooden door and a very particular sounding Jimmy-proof deadbolt lock on it. I had been living there for 5 years, and I was very familiar with the sounds of roommates coming and going through the door that was just above my bed. Anyways, I had just finished pulling on my underwear and stood up and was putting on my shirt, and I hear footsteps on the concrete stoop and then the extremely unmistakable sound of the deadbolt turning. I instantly freeze so I can hear better, thinking I'm out of my mind because I'm the only one living there at the moment, but I can definitely hear the door open and hear footsteps hit the wood floor in the entryway. So now I'm grabbing my aluminum softball bat I keep next to my bed and tiptoeing towards the stairs that go up to the main level, and I'm most definitely hearing footsteps crossing the same way right above me. As I get to the bottom of the stairs, I stop and am listening as hard as I can, and I hear definite footsteps heading right towards the top of the stairs. I decide fuck it, and rush up the stairs in a second with my bat ready, and nothing. There's nobody there. I turn on all the lights and check all the rooms and windows and doors, and everything is locked and bolted. If someone had actually been there, it would have been impossible for them to exit the house before I could catch them and lock the door behind them. The creepiest part was we had literally changed the locks a week before my partner left, and I know the only other key that could open the doors was hiking through South America at the time. Needless to say, I went and crashed with a friend after the bars that night and went home in the day the next day. My parents are immigrants and they've taken me home every summer since I was born to my graduating college, as we have zero family in the US. My maternal family has a house that's been in our family for 100 plus years, which is where everyone lived. By the time I was born, very few people lived there. Others had moved, most had died, and when I was 15, my grandfather passed suddenly. Everyone was a mess. It was and is still one of the hardest things we've gone through as a family. He had this way of hugging you where at the end he'd slap you on the back, but never knew his own strength, so I always ended up stumbling. The entire house was empty except for my grandma and I. My grandmother wasn't coping, my mom wasn't either, so as a result I'd become more of the take control and organized type. I also hadn't properly cried it out aside from a few seconds between mausoleums at the cemetery. My grandmother had asked me to make her some popcorn, so I ran off to the kitchen excited since she hadn't eaten in a while. I sat on the stool she had to sit on while cooking and waited for it to be done. About 2 seconds into being truly alone for the first time in a week, I promptly burst into tears. Like, Kim K, ugly ass, whale dying, stuttering saps. I cannot emphasize this enough. The entire house was empty. My grandmother walks with a cane, due to a disability from when she was younger, and can be heard from a mile away. The doors to the kitchen creaked open and I startled. As I was wiping my face and sniffling, disoriented and a little worried my grandma would see me crying, I felt something slap me hard on the back. I stumbled forward and fell off my stool. I sat on the floor and freaked the fuck out because there was no way if I was going to fall that way with my back against something. Immediately knelt out of there and told my grandmother we didn't have popcorn. LMAO. Now, almost 15 years later, I look back on it a bit fondly. But 15-year-old me was creeped the fuck out. When I was a teen, my mother used to take me to bingo all the time. It was our thing. One night we had a friend of mine with us, and we were driving home. Small towns and backroads in southeast Missouri, back when cell phones were Nokia bricks and Google Maps didn't exist. We got lost about halfway home, as we often did, but my mom was a good navigator so we weren't too concerned. My friend asked what time it was, as they had a curfew. I vividly remember answering 8:42 after glancing at my watch, and my mom saying 8:45 after looking at the clock on the dash. I think the number stuck with me because we then discussed how one of the two was off by a few minutes. Right after the conversation ended, my mother found a road to turn around on, so she pulled in and we saw a metal arch with some cemetery name on it directly in front of us. Out of nowhere the car came to a stop and completely shut off. No dash lights, no nothing, and I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. She tried to start the car a couple times to no avail, then paused to light a cigarette, as she often did when she needed a minute to think or regroup. Right as she flipped her lighter, we all saw a big flash of light. Much brighter than that bit could have produced. And then the car started, despite the fact that our hands were nowhere near the ignition. I suddenly had an absolutely horrible headache, and when I expressed as much they said they did too. We didn't think anything of it, other than it being a bit strange, and she began to back out of the cemetery road. About the time she got back on the main road, she looked down at the dash and said what the F. So we looked to see what was wrong. The clock now read 11:17. Mind you, no less than 5 minutes had passed. I said that it was weird, but maybe the car shutting off had messed with it. I glanced down at my watch to confirm, only to find it now said 11:14. They were still 3 minutes apart, but nearly 2.5 hours had passed and we could not explain it. We kept talking it over and assumed we were just being paranoid. But when we got home, which was about 45 minutes from where we had gone to play bingo that night, it was indeed well after 11 p.m. I've never been able to explain it, and everybody assumes it's a made-up story, but I'll never forget it, and I'll never stop wondering where the time went. The apartment we lived in when I was 11. There were things that would come out of the closet and terrorize me nearly every night for 6 months, starting the same night I watched Ice Age for the first time. It had been a fabulous day. It would usually start after something knocked on the closet door and they would stand, come out / crawl across the ceiling and be around me and jeer. They were hideous and deformed, like they had been burned and healed a bunch of times. I started hallucinating during the day because I could not sleep due to the things scaring me. My parents couldn't take me anywhere because I was so afraid all the time. Cold terror. I was always freezing cold from fear. I started to contemplate suicide. I was 11 and, other than OCD, had no previous mental health issues. There was no indication or symptoms of a psychotic break beforehand, and I definitely was not schizophrenic. This ended shortly after a bunch of family friends came in and sang hymns and prayed over me once a week for the final month, and it stopped happening shortly before we moved. We later discovered that every person who lived in that apartment had broken their lease early. The long-term effects are that I have huge memory gaps from that time period, and I almost always believe people when they tell me their own experiences. I also had / have some form of PTSD and could not watch horror movies / Halloween episodes or play even slightly scary video games. Now I can watch most media, but horror games are mostly beyond me. I like Doom. Thanks for listening. Please do subscribe and watch my other videos.